We like sharing conversations. Arrow.net, ARROE.net. All right, let's pod crash. Episode number 151 is with Jo Piazza from the Pod Club.
I'm good. How are you?
Fantastic. I've been waiting to talk with you, and the reason why is because in 2012, when I was at iHeart, I had this idea of this thing called podcasting, and I remember sitting down with my general manager, and he says, I don't know what the hell you're doing, but keep doing it. And now look at what iHeartRadio is doing.
I know, right? Like, who would have thunk it?
One of the things that you promote on your podcast is the fact that, you know what, it shouldn't be sitting around in a room just yucking it up a little bit. You're trying to get people focused in on what podcasting is.
Absolutely, yeah. One of the points of the Pod Club is we want people to listen to really good podcasts. And I don't actually just love podcasts that aren't very well produced, that are just, I especially don't love it when it's just two celebrities who aren't, and some celebrities are really good, but who aren't great interviewers or storytellers, just sitting on a mic and phoning it in. I love it when podcasts do a really deep dive into great storytelling with really incredible production. And there's so many shows out there like that, but I think it's really hard for an audience to find them. So the goal of the Pod Club is to help people find truly excellent podcasts that they're going to fall in love with.
Well, I like the way that you worked with Chuck Bryant in the way that he says that he likes to listen to humor and stuff like that and not be such a knowledgeable thing. But then you broke it down to the point where all of a sudden Chuck realized the podcasts he does listen to do educate him.
Exactly. We had Chuck Bryant on the Pod Club too, because I thought he was going to talk about podcasts that make you feel smarter, because his show makes me feel smarter every time that I listen to it. And he's like, no, I just need a break. I want to listen to comedy. I want to listen to things that are funny. But we realized two things talking to Chuck. One, that the comedy podcasts he's listening to are like really smart comedy podcasts, but also that he was listening to all comedy podcasts by men. So I told him that he had to go back and dig into the archives of Two Dope Queens, which is one of my favorite comedy podcasts hosted by two incredible women. And it was just so fun because on every episode, even though we have people on each episode of the Pod Club who make podcasts or love podcasts, we always teach them something new and always give them a new podcast to listen to, because there's so many good ones out there that I don't think get nearly enough attention.
A radio question for you is, because they're always on our backs about engage the listener, but at the same time, you've also got to be interactive with the listener, don't you think?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So we have to engage the listener, but I think you have to really interact and find ways to create emotional and intimate connections. One of the best things about audio is it feels like such an intimate form of journalism. You're in someone's ears. I think you have to bring about an emotional response. When I listen to podcasts, I want to laugh. I want to cry. I want to, some of my most parasocial relationships, honestly, are with other podcast hosts for podcasts that I love, which is why it's so fun for me to be hosting the Pod Club and get to have those people on our show. And maybe it's a little creepy for them when I'm like, oh my gosh, I just love listening to you. But it's true. I do. I'm having so much fun making this show.
All right. I'm going to ask you a really deep podcaster's question here, only because I'll swap shop with you here. What podcast were you listening to where you finally decided you got to do something, because you are a podcaster, you are a broadcaster, and you've got to do something to help educate?
Oh, that's so interesting. So are you saying what podcast was I listening to?
Yeah, I'll give you a good example. I was listening to Will Ferrell with was it the new weatherman or the newsman or what, Anchorman, and I thought, no way in hell that this is going to make it. And I said, I've got to do something about this. We've got to train people. And so which one was it for you?
Oh, that's so interesting. There's a lot of them. And honestly, there is a podcast that we featured on the show just last week called Unread. It's by a writer named Chris Stedman. It's another iHeart podcast, and it was just a beautiful, beautiful storytelling podcast ostensibly about grief and trauma, but it made you feel all the things. It made you laugh, it made you cry, and it just did not get enough attention. And I wanted to be able to feature that. I wanted to be able to shout from the rooftops, listen to this, listen to this.
Right.
And when we aired the show, I got so many messages from listeners saying, thank you. I never would have discovered this, because a lot of the good stuff does not surface on the Apple carousel or in the best of lists. And our goal is to help people find things that they truly love, so that they will continue coming back to these creators who are making really good stuff, but who maybe aren't as famous or maybe don't have as huge a following as all the celebrities who have podcasts.
Kudos to you and your conversation with Malcolm Gladwell, because there's a lot of, people don't understand the difference between a podcast as well as just an audio book. And I think that maybe some of the ones that need to be educated are still those listeners. It's like, we're not going to bite you. Get closer.
Exactly. Yeah. I think that listeners, they really, they want to form these connections. And I have to say, I think it's because we've been so disconnected over the past 2 years in the pandemic that we're hungry for real, intimate storytelling too. So much of the journalism that appears online is just terrible, spammy clickbait. And it's also so divisive. What I love about the podcast that we're recommending is they are, most of them, telling stories. I don't typically recommend podcasts where it's just a bunch of people shouting at each other or talking at each other. They're not my jam. There's places to go to get that. I'm looking for shows that do beautiful and interesting and compelling storytelling, because I think we have enough divisiveness and being shouted at in every other corner of the media.
I think one of the biggest faults that the up and coming podcasters do, or there are many times that when you're listening to different podcasts, that you can tell the difference between those that do a podcast versus those that not only do it, but they also are a big fan of podcasting. And that is so important, that you've got to be a listener and support the business of it.
Exactly. It's the same way. And I write books for a living, and the best advice I can give aspiring writers is, oh my gosh, if you want to write really good books, then you need to read really good books. So I read constantly. I read everything, and I also listen constantly. All of my spare time is filled up with just listening to more and more and more podcasts. So if you want to create good podcasts, then you've got to be listening all of the time. You really do.
Do you think you'll ever do a podcast in the way of when listeners mourn the loss of a great podcast? And I was never really a fan of Chris Cuomo, but God dang if I don't miss his podcast because he's not on the air.
Yeah, absolutely. That's so interesting. I've thought about doing an episode of the Pod Club where we just have listeners on Morning Car Talk, that old NPR podcast that ran for so long, which if you had told me what Car Talk was about, I never would have said that I liked it or I was a fan. I don't care about cars. I live in a city. I don't even drive a car, really. Nor do I particularly, am I a particularly big fan of just two middle-aged dudes talking about cars. But I found that show so soothing and comforting, and I don't even think I realized how much I liked it and missed it until it was gone.
I think we should invite you down here to the South, and we go from restaurant to restaurant to try out everybody's different style of barbecue, and we'll let you be the judge on who has the best barbecue in the South.
Oh my gosh, I'm in. I'll get on a plane right now, just as soon as we hang up. Are you kidding? That sounds like a dream job.
I like your mantra in the way that you say life is too short and we can't waste it listening to bad podcasts.
It's true, which is why we play a snippet of the shows in the episode, so you know what you're getting into. I always know if I'm going to like a show within the first minute or two. I'm like, oh yeah, I can vibe with this host. I get this. I like their voice, or I like their approach. So we want you to feel the vibe of a podcast, and my goal really is that you will turn off your Pod Club episode in the middle of it and be like, I have to download this podcast immediately. And because we recommend 4 to 5, sometimes even 6 podcasts in every episode of the Pod Club, I think that there is something for everyone in every single episode.
One of the things that you're proving on the Pod Club is that it doesn't always have to be about the famous people interviews. You open up the door for people to show that, hey, this is a real person over here. Get to know them. Exactly.
And in fact, I will say, because I've been doing Committed, my other podcast, for 4 seasons, and it's a narrative storytelling podcast about marriage and interesting marriages. Our pilot was a couple who was blown up together in the Boston Marathon bombing. We've interviewed an astronaut and his wife. We interviewed Nick Offerman and Megan Mullally, and Nick and Megan were one of one of my best shows. So when I talk about celebrities in a minute, I'm not talking about them because they were incredible, and also two of my favorite people. But I have to say, the best interviews from Committed are the ones with people who have never, ever done a media interview before in their entire lives. Because they are raw and honest, and you can feel them, man. So, and we've had some celebrities on the show who are very media trained, and it's just, it doesn't feel authentic. So I think the stories out there that have to be dug up, where you have to do a little bit more work, those are the ones that will really get you in the end.
So when you're talking about different podcasts and you talk about a podcast being good or one being bad, what is your gauge for determining when a person has gotten something that is bad, and how you determine a podcast is good?
It's interesting. I think it's so personal and so subjective. I might hate something that you love and vice versa. So, and that's why we like to recommend so many different podcasts. But what I will say, and I think this is true of the boom in celebrity podcasts that happened during COVID, I can tell when someone's phoning it in. I can tell when someone is just like, I'm turning this microphone on because I just want to make a buck. And I can tell when someone is turning the microphone on because they love what they do and they're committed to the story and to the storytelling. It shows through. It really, really does. So that's what makes a good podcast. That's the baseline for a good podcast for me, is someone that is committed to this kind of storytelling and is not just phoning it in.
Well, it's been fun watching Conan O'Brien grow into it, because I remember listening to his very first one, and he was like, I don't even know why I'm here kind of thing. But now you listen to his show, and he is so committed to what it's all about.
Exactly. Conan is such a great example of a celebrity who loves this form, who should be in audio. And then, and I don't want to name names because I also don't like to publicly downgrade anyone, but there are celebrities who I think get on the microphone and they don't care. They're like, whatever, this is just another way for me to make some cash. You know, the same as I'm going to star in a car dealership commercial or a commercial for some kind of bottled water. But Conan is so committed. He does so much research for every interview, and you can just tell. You can also tell that he's excited. So one thing I look for in a host is a natural sense of curiosity. I love it when a host is curious about the world and curious about their guests and is just so excited to talk to a person. You can feel that. You really can, and I don't think that you can fake it.
One of the things that was fascinating along the journey, and as it continues to grow, I remember in the early days where comedians said, I'm not going to do a podcast. But I love that Jamie Loftus has really embraced this, because she gives us, it's not really the world of comedy, but she's taken Aack, and turned Kathy into an institution.
Exactly. Jamie Loftus, she's a comedian, she's a writer. She is a Renaissance woman in every sense of the word. And we had her on the second episode of the Pod Club. I adored her podcast, Aack Cast, about the Kathy comic strip, because Jamie is genuinely curious about everything in the world. Everything. She just is. And that the curiosity that she brings to her podcasts is completely contagious. It doesn't matter if you're interested in the Kathy comic strip, you are going to be by the time that you finish with the Aack Cast.
So then, have you ever had one of those moments where, especially maybe in the early days, it's like, okay, what am I going to do now that mom is no longer listening to my show? I've lost my one and only fan.
Well, my mom's never listened to my show.
Oh, my God.
My mom, no, she's never listened to any of my podcasts because she doesn't really know how they work on her phone. I don't think she knows what a podcast is. In fact, one of my 2022 goals is to get my mom into podcasts. And I had a really great suggestion a couple weeks ago of how to do that. She's a big Outlander fan, and apparently there's some good Outlander podcasts. And she also likes weird royal history. So I'm going to give her Dana Schwartz's podcast, Royal Blood.
Oh, my God. Excellent.
And see if that could be her gateway podcast. And in fact, I was supposed to recommend it to her this weekend and I forgot. So I'm going to have to do it when she comes over tomorrow.
Don't you love sitting down? Because I've been with Dana. I've been with Jamie. I mean, your guests have been with me. And don't you love just sitting down and having honest to God conversations with them? And you get to see the human side of their possibility?
Yeah. It's the best. It's just, talking to other creators is a magical experience because people who love podcasts really love podcasts, and I think they're the best ones to recommend them, right? So I really enjoy journalists who love podcasts doing their top 10 lists or podcasts to watch out for lists for the year. But it's also really fun to hear from the people making podcasts about what they're listening to, because you know that they set the bar pretty high.
The creator of Podcast Magazine, Steve, I asked him one time, I said, how do you feel about the cussing that seems to be such a free form on podcasting? And he says the moment that we take that away, that we've lost our freedom of speech. How do you feel about it?
You know, I have a cussing problem. I have a filthy mouth. I don't cuss on the Pod Club because we are also broadcast on the radio, and you know that there are rules about that. On my other podcast, Under the Influence, I have a filthy mouth that I should probably clean up. But there are podcasts that I've listened to, and I hope that I'm not one of them, where the cussing is almost too much, where it just doesn't feel natural, and it feels like they're cussing just for effect. And even me with the mouth of a sailor who hasn't been to port in a long time has been turned off by those podcasts. But it's not cussing that bothers me in podcast. The thing that bothers me the most in podcasting is, you know, podcasts that are essentially just two people yelling and fighting into a microphone. I don't actually listen to very many political podcasts because I think that we're in a very divisive place right now in America, and I'm turning to podcasts to help me learn about the world and explore the world and be curious about the world. And there's just so much divisiveness and hate elsewhere in media that I don't love that genre of podcast.
Not all podcasters have a production team. What is your world like? Do you get to step into a room and there's 25 people around you, or does Jo get to just do her own thing?
Well, I'm in my pajamas for a lot of the day. I don't put on pants. But I do have a great production team. Like, I have a pretty serious podcast production team from iHeart on all of my podcasts who do incredible work. I think that people who aren't in the podcast world don't understand how much goes into producing a really great podcast. But that said, there are some incredible tools out there these days to help people who don't have a team create podcasts. Great recording platforms. We use Riverside, but I've also used Squadcast and Zencaster. And then really good editing platforms. I've been using Descript a lot to edit my audio, to try to help my producers out before they take on some of my interviews.
A lot of people think that they're going to become instant superstars or celebrities when they create a podcast. I mean, I love the conversation with Janine Rubenstein in the way that, you know, it is a celebrity versus a podcast.
Totally. I honestly, frankly, I think everyone loves the idea that they may become super famous just instantly by either writing a book or making a podcast. And I can tell you, after writing 10 books and making 4 podcasts, that I am not a famous person, and no one knows who the heck I am. Getting famous overnight is a rare thing. But I do think that the podcasters that are really committed to the craft will rise to the top and will find their audience.
One of the greatest things about podcasting is the fact that it is a circle of expectation, but it's also respect as well, because unlike radio, podcasters tend to really buddy up a lot more, and they're doing like what you're doing, and that is, let's just promote each other, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we do have to promote each other. I feel like podcasters who love podcasts, we need to be out there shouting from the rooftops about what we're really enjoying. And I feel the same way for authors. I think that for a long time, especially a lot of female authors, thought we were all competing against each other, and that is not true. The tide rises all ships, and I will promote other women authors, and some men sometimes, that I love every single day before I even promote my own books, because it's hard out there, because especially when people's eyeballs are constantly on their social media. And if there is a book or a podcast that you love, please tell everyone to go out and buy it and listen to it and enjoy it, because it's the only way.
How important is it for podcasters to know the history? Because one of the missing pieces in this puzzle is the fact that podcasting started because of writers. Writing led to vlogging. Vlogging led to podcasting. I mean, it's such a transition, but a lot of people don't realize that.
No, exactly. I think that you always have to know the history of everything before you approach a medium. And I think that that's what's missing in a lot of people that kind of jumped on the podcast bandwagon without doing that research, without knowing the history. I have gone back and listened to some really early podcasts, and also, the entire NPR archive, because they've been podcasting before the word podcast existed. You have to know where we're coming from to know where we're going. It's so important.
Absolutely. Well, congratulations on the Pod Club. I love it because you're sharing the stories and stuff like that. You got to come back to this show anytime in the future, Jo.
Oh my gosh, I would love to. I'll come on every week and recommend a podcast for you.
There you go. Let's do it. Let's create.
Perfect.
You be brilliant today, okay?
All right, you too.